This month features my first return guest since December. Andreas Halskov and I spoke nearly 7 years ago when he had just published TV Peaks, his in depth study of Twin Peaks' legacy as television. He's written extensively on David Lynch, and both cinema and TV more generally for the Danish publication 16 by 9, which he helped found. A fan of the series since he was a child, his scholarly approach offers a lot to dig into and riff on, as you'll see in this conversation. In this case, the Patreon half of the conversation is unusually extensive, running close to an hour and a half, well over twice the length of this public clip on YouTube, which is still pretty substantial itself. Topics include Andreas' wonder at Twin Peaks through young eyes, the intricacies of David Lynch's stylistic approach, and the growing dominance of TV over movies in terms of critical attention, both ours and others, among many other subjects. For the full conversation, please subscribe to my Patreon at the $5 a month tier. You'll also unlock all of the other back halves of the Twin Peaks conversations. I've been busy lately, but unfortunately not quite as busy as I hoped, so I'm going to share some of my work and some of what I've had to put aside since the last update, and then we'll get on to the conversation. But I just want to say my ambitious summer plans have seen some success and some failure. First, the success, so far anyway. I'm currently running Lost in Twin Peaks, the public podcast episodes, every day on the third season. So the return from 2017. I'm doing a week for each part, or a couple parts in the case of the premiere, the follow-up, and the finale. And though these were recorded years ago, the re-editing, the illustrated companion presentation take a long time to put together, so I may have to pause it eventually, as I did after sharing season 1 last fall. And while I struggled to get it up on schedule, falling behind and catching up on various pieces, I also finally concluded my 2 weeks of Fire Walk With Me podcast last week, in tune with the 30th anniversary of its premiere at Cannes. This consisted of many hours of material, 14 episodes covering the film, the missing pieces, and just about every nook and cranny of their context, including structural breakdowns, mythological deep dives, historical backgrounds, production details, and readings from archives of critics, fans, and myself. The highlight is probably the climactic episode, The Mysteries of Fire Walk With Me, which flips the mystery question on its head and explores the thematic resonance and narrative construction that surrounds Laura Palmer's story. So definitely check that out. That was on Patreon since August, but now it's open to all of the public, divided up into 14 episodes on podcast feeds wherever you get podcasts, Apple Podcasts, etc. Now, since my last Conversations update, I began the Traumatic Transformations miniseries on Twin Peaks Cinema podcast, publicly sharing episodes on Belladonna of Sadness and The Sweet Hereafter on its own 25th anniversary of the Cannes premiere. Interesting Twin Peaks connections there. The Lost in the Movies public podcast featured The Prestige this month, and on my site, I finally caught up with The Avengers, writing an essay a decade after its debut, seeing it for the first time. This is for a series called the Unseen series that I started a few years ago and paused, where I watch popular movies for the first time. Unfortunately, I had to abandon this series again soon after this because Lost in Twin Peaks needed my focus. For the same reason, I had to sacrifice the written character series, which has been in the works for years. I launched a version of it in 2017 and wanted to update it to include return characters, but I couldn't do both big projects at once, at least not with both of them publishing at the same time. However, I will begin, in fact, I've already begun sharing several advanced character studies each month with all tiers of my Patreon as a new reward. So you can start reading the character series there. Along with several status updates on my site, as I notified readers of all these changes, I'm still tracking my behind-the-scenes progress on all of these projects on the Plan for Journey Through Twin Peaks and More post on lostinthemovies.com, linked in the show notes. And now, on to Andreas. Welcome to Twin Peaks Conversations. My guest this month is Andreas Halskov. We've spoken before. I think we've been on some maybe Twin Peaks Unwrapped episodes together. But certainly the last time that I published something on my site with you was an interview, a print interview. I think we spoke over the phone in 2015 when you had published your book TV Peaks. So obviously that was prior to season 3. And I guess, first of all, before we kind of get into your thoughts on the return or whatever you want to call it, what is your personal relationship to Twin Peaks going back to before you were writing about or studying or publishing about film and TV? And I think, as you've acknowledged, it led you in that direction as well. Like what were your early experiences? Because you watched it quite young, I think.
Yeah, I did. I I don't recall watching it intensely when I was 9. But the first, I'm born on May 27, 1981. So I was 9 and 10 during the airing of the original Twin Peaks when it aired in Denmark. I don't recall exactly when it began airing in Denmark, although I should know it. I've even written about it. But I remember the American air dates better than the Danish ones because I've talked about those more often. But I do remember watching it while I grew up in a small house in a suburban Danish town, which means it's small. It's much smaller than Twin Peaks. It's even smaller than the kind of suburb where I grew up. It's even smaller than Twin Peaks was intended to be. The size of Twin Peaks, as it says on the sign, and I know that it wasn't supposed to say such a big number, is actually the same size as the 5th largest Danish city or something to that effect. So many of our towns are like Twin Peaks size-wise. And we even have that kind of Scandinavian atmosphere, that kind of Scandinavian vibe, although more Swedish-like with hills and mountains. But there is something vaguely familiar about it. The idea that it's a small, close community and all that stuff. And I grew up in one of those with a single mom who worked in a factory. And I went with her to her factory before going to school and was there. So that factory noise, the small town setting, sort of the bucolic working class life, I remember with a great deal of warmth, but it's also uncannily familiar to stuff in Twin Peaks. Although I haven't experienced anything traumatic myself, but then I think she let me watch it, not because she was not a good parent, but simply because she didn't know what it was. I think she thought it was kind of like an Hercule Poirot kind of thing, sort of another murder of the week crime story, of which we had many in Denmark.
So when it was running over in Denmark, was it like maybe half a year behind how it was running in the US in terms of the episodes?
Yeah,
Or did it catch
I
up?
think so. I have. Yeah, I should be able to remember something. Something to me says November 17, and I don't know that 17 might just be a random number. It says in my book specifically, so of course I could just read it. But I mean, it is. I believe it is in November 1990 that it began airing in Denmark. So that would be virtually half a year after, because it was in April that the pilot aired in the US.
And that's the same. That's the same as with the UK. They also began it, I think October or November. And it's interesting because what you're talking about is you would have seen the pilot right around the time that in America they were revealing the killer. Were there any leaks or anything? Was the word circulating of who it was?
No, not in my circle, certainly. I think, I think there's a lot of great stuff to be said for the expansion of the internet and all of this. I suppose we live in I hate to use the word revolution, but certainly in a very big change in terms of communication. And it's lovely that we're able to communicate without having to pay shitload of money in order to do it, and even despite being so far apart geographically. But back then, I think it would have taken much more for it to circulate that rumor or that knowledge, because this was before I don't even know, I don't think I even had, no, I didn't even have internet access back then. And the internet wasn't really a big thing just yet, not broadly at least. And I suppose some of people who were in university or something to that effect might have American friends or might have studied abroad, and they might have access to knowledge, but then it was still something else than skip forward a few years to the point where you start emailing or something. Then it would have been virtually impossible to keep that knowledge from getting to Denmark. But no, I believe people were attached to it in the same way that they were in the US, eagerly awaiting whether to get some new clues in terms of finding out who the killer was. And I remember specifically this Danish male voice announcing what was called episode 15. And it is in fact episode 14, but it was called episode 15 because they had called the pilot episode 1. So that famous, infamous, whatever you call it, episode, of course, where we see Maddie being killed. It was announced, and I just remember that voice announcing that episode saying, tonight we'll show episode 15 of Twin Peaks. And I should remind you, Twin Peaks is not for small children, or something to that effect. And then I watched it, and I was deeply afraid. I couldn't go out to the bathroom afterwards to brush my teeth, or I was afraid that I'd see Leland in the window or Bob in the window, and for a long time afterwards, I was afraid not of Bob. For some odd reason, the long gray-haired man. I mean, that wasn't really what stuck with me as eerie. What was eerie to me was the white-haired Leland, a recurring visitor in my dreams. I had nightmares of me waking up only to see that he was washing our windows and stuff like that. So it was a big part of my life and my nightmares back then, due to perhaps premature exposure.
Did you keep watching after the murder? Did you take a break because you were so frightened, or did you watch through to the end?
No, I kept watching, but I just don't. It's not every episode. It's not as if every episode really left a strong trace. I remember more sort of sequences or elements from the first viewing. I don't remember that much that I watched when I was 9 or 10. I watched a lot of pretty bad stuff at that point. I mean, I watched Hellraiser also when I was that same age, The Shining, Alien, a lot of stuff that I suppose wasn't necessarily meant for kids, but it's not as if much of that didn't really stick with me. So in the same, I watched Twin Peaks, but I only remember fragments of it. I remember parts of the ending, certainly, which was even more scary than the killing of Maddie, I think. And then, yeah, I remember other parts of it, but the part from Caleb Deschanel's episode where he's driving in his car with Maddie in the trunk, I remember parts of it, but in fragments. I guess I almost watched it or remember it as David Lynch would want it, as disembodied scenes in fragments, not as a narrative meant to be unlocked and understood, but I was deeply inspired by it. And I remember wanting to make sort of a small school film where I thought I had all these ingenious ideas and they were just lifted directly from Twin Peaks. And the killer in my film was the psychiatrist, because I was sure that Russ Tamlin's character, or Dr. Jacoby, was the killer. So all of these ideas that I thought were my own original ideas for the small school film were in fact I lifted directly from Twin Peaks, because that just became my point of inspiration. But I don't remember that much from when I was 9 and 10, to be honest. at that point, we had only two major channels in Denmark in 1990, apart from some German channels that were unsubtitled. So so Denmark was a small industry. We had DR, which was Danish Broadcasting Corporation. It's the biggest company. It's the biggest Danish television public service channel, and that was the one, the channel that showed Twin Peaks. And then we had TV2, at the time a fairly recent channel that came out in 1988. So there wasn't that much that you could choose between, and we didn't have a lot of American stuff really. DR had showed Dallas or something to that effect. But I mean, TV2 showed Hill Street Blues, I believe, but American stuff was not the model upon which DR was built. DR was built on the BBC as a model. So much of what we saw came from England. And of course, also Danish stuff that was created in Denmark. So I remember watching parts of it. I can't remember all of it, but I can certainly remember specific episodes because I was led to my own devices watching it. And it was not understandable to me. I don't think that it's necessarily meant to be understood at an intellectual level, but I didn't understand anything about, but the atmosphere and the tonality of it certainly translated even to a child at my age, but it also was immediately fascinating. The music, the tonality, the look of it, the feel of it. It has a tactile feel, I think. It's almost as if you can smell it, you can sense it, you feel you're there. And I guess I had a longing to go there from a very early age. And then as I grew older, we didn't have many sort of reruns back then, but they did a rerun of it when in 1997, when a small niche channel connected to the DR's network called DR2 came along, and they started airing it on Tuesdays, I believe it was, and I watched it. I was in school back then, and I watched it with my friend. We watched it separately. We didn't watch it together, but then we talked about each episode the day after. So it was 9 o'clock at night on a Tuesday, every episode sponsored by Circle Coffee, a brand of coffee in Denmark. And each episode followed by some expert into the making of pies or into Badalamenti's music or something to that effect, talking about an aspect or creating interesting American-like pies or stuff like that. And it was deeply satisfying to go back and revisit something that had been a major part of my childhood, yet I hadn't really understood, and then now trying to understand it and grasp it. And that made me want to study film, and it made me want to once go there, which I thought was virtually impossible. Washington State, not that I knew anything about Washington State really, but America in general just seemed so far away, and we didn't have nowhere near the kind of money you'd need to buy a ticket to go to America. So I dreamed that one day I'd be able to go to that place. And then, suppose flash forward to some years later, and things have changed remarkably. So a ticket to America isn't really that expensive, and I'm certainly able to buy it by now. And those people who were in Twin Peaks, those people who created it, perhaps with the exception of a few very big stars and David Lynch himself, of course, are fairly accessible. You can even talk to them.
So to fast forward 25 years, season 3 comes out. This is, you at this point, you've written a book about Twin Peaks. You've written the book about David Lynch. You're coming to this sort of prepared in a sense, but what was your reaction, your thoughts about the season 3? And in this time, of course, watching it presumably at roughly the same time as the Americans were seeing it.
Yeah, I watched it at the premiere in Cannes.
Oh, that's right. I think I remember you saying that. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Talk about a change, huh?
Yeah, and I only did that because of Twin Peaks. Uh, I mean, it's not. I mean, I like a good party, and I like watching films, but um, I'm not really a glitz and glamour guy. I'm not really a red carpet guy, to be honest. So all of that phoniness that doesn't really appeal to me. Um, but and I'm not a big journalist. I have written stuff also for the biggest newspapers in Denmark, but I'm not attached to any one of those. I'm an editor, as I said, of a small, very niche film critical scholarly journal, and I just, you know, I tried seeing whether I could, could I become an accredited film journalist from Denmark and at the Cannes Film Festival, and I tried, and by golly, they accepted they accepted me, and so that still is kind of baffling to me. That tells me that many of the so-called journalists who are there covering films, are perhaps hopeful amateurs, bloggers, stuff like that. Anyway, I went there really only ever to talk about Twin Peaks, and in the in hopes of getting an interview with David Lynch. That was sort of uh, that was really my goal. That didn't happen, but I watched the premiere and I covered it for the premiere for TV2, which is the second largest, as I mentioned earlier, Danish TV station. And I remember telling them what I expected of it, and that small segment of me saying that is still, you can still find that on YouTube, and I believe I would still to this day say much of what I said at that point, many of the same things I said. I don't think people should expect for it to be the same as the original. I think if people expect too much of the old Twin Peaks to come back in the same form, if they don't accept it'll be a new iteration, then I think they'll be disappointed. I think they should expect that it'll be more Lynchian in ways that we like and in ways that perhaps many people will not like. It'll have slower pacing at times and a much more intense sound design. And it'll be also at points more sketchy. The style will be more radical in a way. I mentioned some of those things, then I said I don't, there are of course storylines that I would like to know more about. And then I mentioned that I would like to know about Diane, and I would like to know about what happened to Annie. And apart from the what happened to Annie, I think everything I said there I would still say. When then I watched the new Twin Peaks, and I remember watching those two first episodes in conjunction, I thought this is brilliant. The first two episodes, it doesn't feel like Twin Peaks to me, but it's brilliant. I loved those first two episodes. Watched them in conjunction, and it felt like bits of it felt like Lost Highway. Bits of it felt like Eraserhead. Certainly the black and white sequences. Bits of it felt a little bit like Twin Peaks, but not really. Some of it felt like I don't know, a little bit like Mulholland Drive. And we had this, it had sort of a different feel to it, I would say. So that was my immediate reaction, was that I liked it, and it got a standing ovation. I think many people liked those first two. Those were not the challenging ones. What happened afterwards was the challenge. And I absolutely liked the third episode too, or part three. And then I think part 8 is just amazing. I think that's an exceptional piece of, I don't know what it is, but an exceptional piece of cinema, television. As Dwayne Dunham has said, it's an island, and I love that island in and of itself. But then there are also parts of the new Twin Peaks that I think are, well, like parts in Inland Empire. I can see why Inland Empire is an auteur's trademark film, but I can also see that it includes all of those trademarks. It includes that experimental vibe where parts of the experiments I love, parts of them to me look like a man seeing whether he can paint an image with dirt. And well, by golly, it looks like a sort of a sketchy image painted with dirt. So that's how I felt about the new Twin Peaks. Feel that parts of it are exceptional. I think the whole endeavor is exceptional. And I like certainly that it's challenging and that it doesn't please me and doesn't allow me to get back nostalgically to the original Twin Peaks. But it parts of it are also still kind of frustrating or annoying.
What are the parts of season 3 that don't work as well for you?
I think I hope it's okay to use the term Dougie and not have to discuss whether it's Dougie or not Dougie. But the Dougie sequences, let's call it that, right? The sequences where he has to pee, for example. I felt there were episodes, was my immediate reaction. I've since watched it a few times, but my immediate reaction was, I mean, I really don't want to see Dougie having to pee in each and every shot. That felt like some of those very Lynchian humor elements in the original, like the one with hospital food in the original Twin Peaks, where we have this, to me, kind of annoying sound effect, this something like that. Slightly jokey, corny, similar to On the Air. I can see where he's coming from. It's all very plasticky and it's alienating. It might be Brechtian. We can call it different things, but it certainly felt that way to me. What I like most about Lynch is when he engages me and when I'm just I just sink into this other world. When he kind of pushes me away, when he does something that's meant to sort of alienate me from the experience, well, he usually succeeds with that, but I like that less so, even if I can appreciate the effort. So I was much more into those very radical episodes that were very stylized, like Part 8 or Part 3. Due to the color, that was like sinking into a picture. It's like sinking into a painting to me. When it becomes painterly, I love it. When it becomes sketchy, not so much.
What did you think of the finale, let's call it, parts 17 and 18, which might be two different answers because they are two
Yeah.
very different episodes, but in relation to that quality, did you find those to be more powerful or more slight in the sense you were talking about?
Well, I certainly, the sequence where Cheryl Lee yells outside of the house, I think it's just, that's just a staggering moment in the entire series across all 3 seasons. I think that's absolutely wonderful. I think there are parts of those 2 last episodes, there are elements there that are wonderful. And I can sort of see the idea and I can appreciate the idea behind it. Also, the idea of stretching time and having us wait for a long time, just driving. I do appreciate that. I actually like the ending of it. But, well, and even if it makes sense, the entire Green Glove thing, that particular aspect of it was kind of not me. That was not fitting to my sensibility. But I know that this is very, I mean, I'm venturing into dangerous territory. I'm talking to people who know a lot about Twin Peaks and who are deeply invested. And it feels sometimes, and I certainly do not want to alienate anyone, but it seems sometimes in this community, a community that I treasure greatly, saying something just slightly skeptical about anything that has to do with David Lynch is is dangerous. You'll quickly be put in your place for not understanding it. And for me, his work has never been about understanding. I don't think even he would say. I think for me, it's always been about a feeling. And that's the entire idea behind the art of paradox, is that the major paradox for me when engaging with any Lynch production is that I immediately want to try to unlock it and understand it and pick it apart and dissect it and piece it together and understand what did all this mean. But I understand also at a much greater level, which I think is a more profound and more central understanding, that you can't do that. You can't, it's not like a puzzle you can piece together and then you've just finished it. It's not like that. And that's also what's profoundly sensational about his work. That's what makes it great. I mean, we can all say that Lost Highway, perhaps, we all know the basic readings about that film. We know the basic readings of Mulholland Drive, and I guess there are 3 or 4 different readings that you see in multiple variations or iterations, but then that's not really interesting. It still is a profound experience every time. And I don't think you ever you can't empty it out. Susan Sontag once talked about going against interpretation and embracing eroticism. And to me, an eroticism of reading, that is. To me, Lynch's work is about eroticism. Eraserhead is not to me about fatherhood. It might be, but to me, Eraserhead is just sinking into an industrial world of smokestack industry and wonderful chiaroscuro lighting, and it just has its own pacing, it has its own tone, it has its own sound, colors, this charcoal feel to it. Everything is it's just wonderfully vibrant. And the new Twin Peaks, it has this tonality. It has its own tonality, and it's so different from the original Twin Peaks, I think. Even if some of the music is also made by Badalamenti, and some of the leitmotifs are the same, and some of the new leitmotifs, like Heartbreaking, are in a similar vein, it still feels like a new version of Twin Peaks, much like Fire Walk With Me did when that came out.
We're going to get into some of the differences between the old series and the new stylistically, because I think you have a particularly keen eye for the formal elements of cinema/television. Before we get to that, though, tell the listeners a little bit about your work on Twin Peaks and David Lynch, that book, but also other things you've written that may or may not be available to various audiences. And the videos, of course, too. Or sorry about that.
Some of it will be available, but perhaps not understandable to foreign audiences.
Fair enough.
Well, I made a book about David Lynch back in 2014, I think it was, a Danish book called Paradoxes Kunst. That's the Danish title for it. I don't know of anyone outside of Scandinavia who owns that book, apart from one person. His name is Mirt Kummel, and we swapped books. He wrote a Slovenian book about Lynch, and I called Twin Peaks in Postmodernism, and I wrote what would translate into The Art of Paradox, a book about the entire oeuvre of David Lynch up until 2014, of course, the publication date. And we swapped those books. I don't know that he would be able to understand anything in my book. I've tried my best to sort of grasp small elements of his book, but I can't really read it since I don't know Slovenian. But that book has since then, and that I guess we could return to that when talking about The Return, or whatever we call it, season 3, has since then become sort of a jumping off point for trying to make an English version, but it's become a much bigger project because I wanted the English version of The Art of Paradox to be sprawling and undefinable. I wanted it to be not a traditional academic book, not a traditional journalistic book, not a traditional biographical run through of David Lynch's life, not a chronological run through of his different works, but a strange meeting place between sort of a philosophical approach to his work and a more essayistic and sprawling thing. And I've also, gathered the rights for numerous different kinds of paintings and photographs from different, also fairly renowned artists worldwide who are inspired by his work in different ways. And I don't know, conducted numerous interviews with people who've worked with him, going back to his early short films in The Race Ahead and up all the way through Inland Empire. Yet the book is still underway, and it's sort of or the English version of it. The Danish version is still there, but I believe it's sold out. I don't know. It wasn't printed in that many copies, but then it's become sort of and I'm certainly not comparing myself to Pynchon, but it's become sort of my Mason and Dixon, an impossible book in a way. If at this point, if I were to publish it, it certainly has to be the best thing I've written. So, but the publisher asked me whether he could have something next year. So that's what I'm hoping. And then in between, I made TV Peaks, which, as you said, came out in 2015, and it's about Twin Peaks and its relation to, or it's sort of a way to see. So some people talk about, and you will know that I've seen much of what you've done, heard much of what you've done, and I consider you a film scholar and a Twin Peaks scholar at the same time. So while many Twin Peaks and David Lynch fans and aficionados might be interested in films by many different writers and directors, it's as if at the center of it is Twin Peaks and David Lynch, and I consider you more of a sort of a film historian and a film scholar, and then David Lynch and Twin Peaks are also part of that. I'm that way, at least, and so I was interested in trying to see, just like some people would see A Bout de Souffle by or Breathless by Godard as sort of a point of change in film history. Could we see that as a central piece in film history? I wanted, in a similar way, to see how can we see Twin Peaks or view television history through the lens or prism of Twin Peaks.
To close off the public part, I just want to have you tell people where they can find you online, but also what you've written, where they can find that, and maybe even what's in store.
Yes. I'm a pretty accessible guy, I guess. You can find me on different social media. I don't use TikTok, for example. I use Instagram, but not that much. I'm more of you can hear from our talk right now, I'm verbose. So I'm best at those kind of old geezer social networks like like Facebook, for example. People can find me there. I'm easy to find because there aren't that many Andreas Halskovs in the world. And you can find me on Twitter too. My writing, you can find different places. Well, 16 by 9, which is our scholarly journal of film, you can find it there. We also cover television stuff and have audiovisual essays. That's something that you and I both really enjoy. The next thing that's coming up in that sense is a video essay, I think, by Cristina Alvarez Lopez and Adrian Martin. And we cover everything from very niche-oriented Taiwanese films to broadly popular TV series, documentaries, and everything. And it's long reads, if people enter that. Some of it is in Danish, but we also have an entire in English section. Beyond Television, you can find on Amazon. That's my new book. TV Peaks, you can also find. A new version of that is coming out, only in an ebook version though, but I'm updating that and it'll come out next year.
There's also, just on the formal level, the way that the work feels, there's something markedly different between the Lynch, even just the Lynch directed episodes of the original series, and particularly I think Firewalk with Me, where it all culminates, and then his his voice or his vision, so to speak, in The Return. How do you see that distinction? Where do you see commonalities and where do you see a divergence between the two eras of Lynch?
Yeah, I think we're in line. I think there are pretty striking differences.
That's it for this public conversation. But as I said, there's another hour and 28 minutes of discussion on patreon.com/lost in the movies. You can join as a $5 a month patron and get immediate access to that and also the back parts of all the other previous Twin Peaks conversations, as I said. So definitely check that out. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with more Twin Peaks conversations as well as everything else that I discussed in here.